Hi, I'm Dr. Dell Gines. Pleasure to be here with you today, coming from my home, like most of you are. Pandemic, but it seems like we're near the end, so hopefully next time we can do it in person. I am the lead community development advisor from the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City. And for those not familiar with the Federal Reserve Bank system, we basically conduct the monetary policy of the United States of the nation of the United States. And we have 12 regional banks, and we also work at the Board of Governors with the Board of Governors. Our primary responsibilities are really monetary policy, banking regulations, and ensuring the safety and soundness of the national payment system. But my division is a very specific division that came out of the 1970s due to redlining and what Congress created a rule called the Community Reinvestment Act. And from that act, it's designed to stop those redlining practices, which essentially was banks would take deposits from areas, most often communities of color, and not want to lend money in them. And so, as we've expanded our responsibilities within this department, I've developed a specific responsibility for the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City, which is small business and economic development with a focus on our low and moderate income populations. And to that end, I put out a variety of works on the subject, starting way back when I started in 2011, called the Grow Your Own Guide. We focus on entrepreneurship ecosystem building, spend a lot of time in rural communities. And our most recent few pieces of work were the Black Women Startups Report, Building Entrepreneurship Ecosystems in Communities of Color, and the one that we released last year and are going to do a significant outreach this year, as well as some training around, is the Small Business Owners of Color Recovery Guide, which I wrote with my peer, Janelle Williams from the Atlanta Fed. So if any of those are of interest to you, please make sure that you check them out. But I do want to talk specific about this concept of entrepreneurship ecosystem building and policies and inclusive entrepreneurship ecosystem building policies. I think more than ever, we need to really have this conversation, which we continue, but even amplified significantly more across the nation. For example, a recent small business credit report that we produced at the Federal Reserve Bank just came out on the issues faced by small business owners of color. And a few of the things that came out of that report, I mean, most of you are already familiar with, some of the historic, disparities that our communities of color facing in the entrepreneurial space. But even more vividly, it came out that Black and Hispanic owned firms were half as likely to be fully approved for some of the stimulus money as white firms. Businesses owned by people of color were more likely than white-owned businesses to report reducing operations or temporary closing during the pandemic. Of course, we know that a lot of these businesses, Black, white, and other, have closed, but it significantly impacted our firms of color more. 93% of Asian-owned firms, 86% of Black-owned firms, and 85% of Hispanic-owned firms reported sales declines due to the pandemic, compared with 79% of white-owned firms. So we know that there's been disparities historically. We know that the pandemic has exacerbated them in many ways. And so as we come out of this with the energy that has been occurring based upon what I call the social justice summer around the George Floyd incident last year, carrying over into this year, the rise of corporations and other large institutions saying that they want to tackle inclusivity head on during this time, and what we need to do to really get our economy going and becoming robust over the long run based upon demographic shifts, is now no better time than ever to ensure that we're focusing on ecosystem building and that it's inclusive, focusing on communities of color as well as non-communities of color. So when we define inclusion, I have a functional definition that I put in the manual for that I co-authored for the International Economic Development Council, which is the largest certifying body for economic developers in the United States. It's fortunate enough to write the sections on inclusivity and diversity. And my functional definition of inclusivity is the active identification of, listening to, support of, and elimination of barriers for entrepreneurs from socially and economically disadvantaged groups and geographic regions. And so what does that look like from a cultural standpoint? And I guess I should back up just half a step to explain to you why I'm setting this framework for you, because I don't have a prescription for what you need to do at the local level. But what I can offer you is some frameworks and some examples, which is what I intend to do when we talk about the cultural side. These are things that you need to embed within your policymaking, whether it's public municipal policymaking, corporate policymaking, or other forms of communal government. This inclusive culture. And so what is these inclusive culture frameworks that you should be considering? First, an inclusive culture is one that continually evaluates itself, asking whether it's is as inclusive as possible at a given amount of time. The second is that it's as democratic as possible, receiving insight from various diverse stakeholders and empowers various diverse stakeholders. It's not enough to have people at the, participating. Are they empowered? Do they have a sense of authority? Are they in the governance decision? Is that part of your culture? And finally, it's nimble and adapts to the challenges and the express needs of various stakeholder groups as fast and as reasonable as possible. We know we can't be all things to all people, but are we constantly looking at our inclusive work, the way it's rolled out in policy, the way it's rolling itself out in practice? These are things that just need to be part of your culture. So let's talk a little bit about the ecosystem, so we can set the stage for policy making and inclusive policy making in the ecosystem space. So entrepreneurship ecosystem, I distilled down into six common components, six elements, if you will. The entrepreneurial skills that are available to your entrepreneurs. Are they getting skilled up? Do they have the ability to actually run a high quality organization? Can they manage it? Do they have the financing skills? All of these other things that go into making a good entrepreneur. That's one element. Of course, financing, the one that we talk about quite a bit, the access to credit and capital, the ability to, have personal assets, if you will, to put into it, to go out and get a bank loan, to get, if it's a big scaled up company, venture capital access through all of those factors. The concept of relationships. This is the third piece, what we call social capital. Do our entrepreneurs have high quality networks that are giving them access to opportunity, information, and awareness of opportunity? A big one that is very under talked about is the concept of culture. Is a local culture to entrepreneurs that celebrates entrepreneurship, encourages risk taking, dusts them off and picks them up when they fall down, celebrates them? Is it in the newspaper? Are we doing ribbon cuttings for them? Infrastructure. We're both talking about digital, such as access to broadband, which we know is a challenge in both urban and rural communities, and also physical. What are the streetscapes like? Are we doing facade improvements? Do you fix the potholes? That's a big issue for us in Omaha quite a bit. And then finally, the last component of an ecosystem is the policy side, which is what we're talking about today. Do we have ecosystem policies that are connecting the dots between these various other elements? Are we putting dollars into access to credit and capital, access to high quality infrastructure, all of these other factors that we talked about? Now, the important thing to consider with ecosystems is that it's not just having the elements available. It's, are they entrepreneurial centered and informed by entrepreneurs? And are they connected together in a meaningful way where they're creating synergy together, where they're collaborative, where the stakeholders are working together to continue to assess the ecosystem to make sure that it's doing the best job for our entrepreneurs as possible. So let's talk a little bit about policy, the policy side of things. So there's four basic elements of policy that governments and local municipalities have. The power of subsidy, which means, let's think about, if you all remember Amazon, where communities were trying to mortgage the farm to get Amazon $3 billion incentive packages, $2 billion incentive packages, etc. This is known as industrial attraction. So the power of subsidy. How do we apply this in the entrepreneurial space is the question, to make it very inclusive. Are we looking at policy from the standpoint of grants, tax abatements, dedicated training programs, reduced costs for borrowing, all things that government policymakers can actually do with an inclusivity? Of course, we have the power to regulate. There's been a lot of conversation in diverse communities about regulating, or are we over regulating things like women who want to start hair braiding versus going through the traditional long certification route that hair care estheticians, et cetera, do. Things like that. What about zoning regulations? Is it discriminatory? Does it have bias? Can it be eased up? Sometimes we heard stories about the facade, being 1 inch too long, and how much that costs to remediate that in older buildings and properties, oftentimes in urban and diverse communities. Can we change those things? The power to inform and exhort. This is one where the government basically has the capacity through the policy mechanisms, which doesn't even require legislative support, to go out and give information out to the public, to encourage certain types of activities, convening stakeholders, all of these things through networks. These are things that governments can do right away that often don't take any kind of approval from the legislative body process. It's simply just going out and saying, we want to expose our entrepreneurs and our diverse entrepreneurs to all of these things that we have or to the others that are in our network. And then finally, government has the power to engage in enterprise. This is procurement policies that support entrepreneurship, broader privatization of existing government businesses, things like that. We talk a lot about the amount of dollars that goes through the government in a given year. Are our procurement policies diverse and inclusive? Are we actively looking to support diverse borrowers to make sure that they're getting access to government contracts to the degree possible and ensuring that they're able to leverage their business? For example, a lot of people talk about in I believe the late 70s, early 80s in Atlanta, which is now known as one of the hotbeds of Black entrepreneurship. A lot of that existing business today was started because of policy and procurement policy around the airport, which was able to leverage all of these different minority contractors to be able to help them scale up their businesses, produce tremendous amount of wealth, multiple millionaires, and revitalize Atlanta, making it a hotbed for African-American entrepreneurship and business. So again, we have the power of subsidy, regulatory power, the power to inform and exhort, and the power to engage in enterprise. And the question, if we go back to our culture of inclusivity, are we actively looking through these lenses as we do these policies to ensure that we're making sure that people, women, diverse individuals, diverse geographies can adequately access it? Or are we just at status quo? Are we saying this is what we do? We've always done it this way and we're going to keep doing it this way? Or do we have that culture of really seeking to listen to the individuals that we want to support, these diverse entrepreneurs within the ecosystem, and then make responsive policies within that space? And so if those were the policy powers, what are the policy targets? I'm going to talk specifically about entrepreneurship focus. And so you can have what we call people-based policies, place-based policies, or a combination of both of those two. So if we think of people-based policies, this is often what we see when we have things like diverse procurement numbers, since we're on the topic of procurement. So are we targeting 10, 15, 20% diverse spend with our procurement? People-based policies. Are we ensuring that we're hiring or we're creating dedicated funds in potential to diverse entrepreneurs who may have had trouble getting access to capital? Well, you can do this in a lot of ways through your community development block grant funds, through other different sources, contingent upon the discrimination or non-discrimination policies that you have. But anyway, people-based policies really focus on the demographic group that you're trying to empower, that you're trying to include, the entrepreneurs that you're trying to scale up from specific demographic groups or geographic groups, if you will. Well, geographic groups is when we get to the place-based focus. So most of us are familiar with opportunity zones and that concept and how they looked at specific census tracts that could apply for it and got this special federal designation. Now, I know there's been some challenges with opportunity zones, but if we look at it conceptually, what they tried to do is create a place-based policy that will leverage opportunities within a targeted zip code that was challenged. We can do the same thing from an inclusivity standpoint by focusing on places that have high concentrations of specific demographic groups that we want to include. And so in my community in Omaha, it's called North Omaha, predominantly Black community, the only minority majority community or zip code in the city. We could have a policy, let's say, built like an opportunity zone or old Clinton enterprise zone policy that really focuses on this place, because we know that by that policy, leveraging the things that we want to support in the ecosystem, we're going to support a predominant number of African Americans and now Latinos, Sudanese, and other people that live within our community. Or you can do a combination of both. Like you could say, we want to focus on inclusivity for a specific group, but we want to also do it within specific geographic focus. So you kind of narrow down the focus. And I don't think we need to go much deeper into that. But again, we're working on frameworks. Do you have a culture of inclusivity? Are you leveraging the four functions of government policymaking power with an inclusive lens? Do you have specific policy targets for people or place that are readily identified and that are leading you to inclusivity? And I want to close on two examples. The first example is a geographically inclusive strategy called Network Kansas, what I happen to write my PhD dissertation on. They're now in 66 communities across Kansas, and they started in 2007 from the Kansas Growth Act. And essentially what Network Kansas e-communities do is they create a shared loan pool through tax credits that allow local communities To organize through a collaborative process, they have to have a collaborative group of individuals that form this e-community from a community. A committee could be dedicated community members, it could be bankers, it could be other kind of support providers. They have to come together, and they actually get to lend the money that Network Kansas raised through the tax credit sales on their own. They get to choose who they lend it to at the local level. They get to choose what programs they're going to focus on at the local level. They get to build the networks at the local level, but they get support from the state. So this is one policy that has allowed tremendous geographic inclusivity in Kansas, primarily focusing on rural communities. The second example is my friend Rodney Sampson from OHUB. He recently launched last year something called Innovation Districts. And they call them Innovation and Equity Districts. And these are really, really interesting because they're a joint venture that focuses on real estate development corporations, community foundations, colleges, cities, public-private partnerships. There's different ways you can arrange it through the policymaking process. And these Innovation and Equity Districts are mixed-use residential, commercial, and retail community concepts. And what they do is they house OHUB's early exposure, immersive learning, startup support, and investing program in socially disadvantaged communities, probably based upon the same type of census tracts that the opportunity zones focus on. And Rodney focuses on the fourth industrial revolution, as he calls it, or high-tech growth-oriented businesses within these spaces. A lot of early stage training, but what it does is allow local municipalities to have a dedicated model to create policy support for through their organizations within a dedicated geographic and demographic focus, and ultimately try to create these high growth tech entrepreneurs from communities of color. So that's Rodney Sampson's OHUB district. So you have two methodologies that you can look at, or examples that you can look at to kind of think through as you develop your own. And so where do you start? First, you make an uncomfortable commitment to inclusion. If it's comfortable, you're probably not doing it right because you're probably falling into status quo traps. The second is focus on policies that first start connecting people and then start filling out the gaps in the capacities for diverse entrepreneurs via geographic or demographic challenges and that have been left out of that. So don't try to eat the whole elephant. Focus first on connecting, building your networks. Second, work within the network, listen to them, and then gap fill. And finally, as you're listening to your entrepreneurs, you got to make it a special commitment to listen to entrepreneurs in communities of color and recognize that these entrepreneurs of color often have greater difficulty navigating the ecosystem, which means getting to you. So you need to be the one that reaches out, has the coffee, has the focus groups, does the surveys. And that's all that I have for you in my short window of time. If you want to catch up with me and have any questions, feel free to follow me on Twitter at I am Dell Gines, or you can follow me on LinkedIn, which is just Dell Gines. That's my presentation for you today. Let's go out and really make this nation more inclusive for entrepreneurs, build a better economy, better quality of life, and more social justice. Thank you.